One of the main things that I do in my work is provide teaching meal support. Uh, we have a couple of videos that are really great resources. This is something probably really helpful for you to look at, but especially helpful for parents, just to give them a bit of the idea that of what they can do to help. We also have a video that's more specifically on bulimia and how you can approach meal support for bulimia. And this third link is a workshop that I did and is recorded online that talks a bit more about my workshop stuff. Anyway, all of us have challenges in life. My challenge apparently is I'm a hand talker, and so the microphone moves away from me. So I'm working on that. I think, like many people, I get very nervous talking in front of groups. One thing that's helpful is I'm organized. Another thing that's helpful is that I have people and I have friends here with me. And this is really the core of what I'm talking about, that when you're trying to do something that's difficult, how can you get through that? So what we know from earlier is that eating disorders are really serious. We can think of food as medicine as one way to kind of help us think about what we're doing. Medicine isn't something that people want to take. They're not happy about it. They don't enjoy it. But you have to do it. Youth need to gain weight to be healthy. And most of the time, they don't really want to gain weight. So the question then is, how do we get them to eat? And this is a hard question. And if you think about it, or try and answer that question, it gives you certain kinds of answers. So about how do we make them, how do we force them, how do we get control over these people, how can we use our power to force someone to do something that's difficult. I had someone in just yesterday, a new patient into our program, and she sat down for lunch with me, and she didn't eat. And I was kind of stuck, because that's really hard when someone doesn't want to eat. How do you convince them to eat? So Karen and I, that's why she's here, we do a group with the youth once a week. And we also do the parent support group. So we tried asking different questions. What makes it difficult to eat? So all youth eat sometimes in some amounts, and sometimes different day to day. But sometimes it's harder than other times. So we ask the kids, so on a day that it's harder, what makes it harder? And on a day that it's hard, what makes it easier? Kids gave us all kinds of different answers, and we asked staff as well, and we asked parents as well what was helpful. And we tried to just kind of divide this up into some different categories. So one thing was that there's something about having an eating disorder. There's some identity that's involved in there. And if you are eating, what does that say about your identity? So if I'm an anorexic and I'm having a cheeseburger, I'm not being a very good anorexic. So maybe something's made me more sensitive about that. Clothes were a little tighter today. I saw someone really skinny walking down the street. So identity might have something to do with what makes it difficult today. Some of the things that people talked about earlier, Riley mentioned it and Karina mentioned it, was externalizing the eating disorders. One way that we can challenge identity. One way that we can challenge identity is by getting these kids to eat. That might help them move along. Some of the other answers we got were about relationships. Sometimes it has to do with who's around you, so who you're eating with, if you're eating with more people or strangers, if you're eating with a supportive parent or a stranger or an unsupportive parent. Sometimes there's a bit of a communication involved in not eating. And so part of what we work on, part of what Kathy was talking about, was really engaging with kids, that we want to build this relationship. And part of what Karen was talking about was that family therapy and how do we strengthen that relationship. Sometimes some motivation is involved in the kids' answers. And on our unit, sometimes there's a pass that's been taken away and now it's not worth it to eat. Or I'm not going to graduate this semester anyway, so I might as well not bother. I'll just wait another 6 months until it's kind of worth it.
A big one they didn't say was, I'm going to go into the hospital on Tuesday, and so if I'm going to go into the hospital, I'm going to be the sickest anorexic, and so all eating is off the table.
And sometimes people have been trying hard and they still go into the hospital and say, well, forget it.
Too hard, I give up.
I was eating to stay out and now I'm in. You mentioned Pat, and she gave us this slide. Sometimes focusing on motivation is kind of a trap. Karina was talking about that we don't really look to motivation for these kids on getting them to eat, because that comes and goes and can drag us into a bit of a trap. Parents tend to look to motivation as how do we get these kids to eat? How do we make them want to? How do we make them realize the importance of this? And those kind of arguments don't tend to work, and they really don't tend to work when someone is really stressed out.
One of the activities that Tom and I have done in the group that he's talking about is ask the kids what the costs of their eating disorder are. And they list that they could die, that they're ruining their bones, that their hair is falling out, that they're isolating from their friends. They list the whole list. And when we take it to parents, they say, don't they realize?
Just tell them that.
Just tell them, just teach them. And we're like, well, they know. They know. So some of these arguments are just moot points. They're not useful.
So we think motivation is a long-term factor that's important, that when you start to see what's happening when you're getting healthy and you can go back to school and you start to get interested in things, that might be where motivation kind of kicks in. And sometimes we do get motivated patients. That's exciting and weird. So the last kind of category that kids talked about, and what they really talked about most, was that the reason it's hard to eat right now is something scary or something's making me worried. So they'll talk about, well, it's a harder food, it's a more challenging food, something I haven't eaten for a long time. They'll talk about they had a hard day, they just can't do it right today. Or they had a hard family therapy session, or they just got an increase on their meal plan, or they saw something that made them worry about what they were doing. And that is really the predominant thing that kids talk about when we ask them what makes it hard today. So that's probably a good area to focus on if that's what they're talking about the most. So we ask kids what's going to help if you're anxious. And the type of things that they say is, well, give me less, or give me something safer, or let me choose something different. Let me have some control. Let me get into the kitchen. Let me make sure. Let me eat what I want. And then I will not be anxious, and then I can do it. So they focus on reducing this anxiety through avoidance. And obviously that is not a very helpful way to handle this anxiety when you need to eat. We need to find some other way to manage anxiety rather than just avoiding it. Oop. And that is meal support. So meal support we think of as strategies that we use over time that are going to manage anxiety and make things easier. When we make things easier for someone, then they're more able to do it. So if kids are really stressed out about eating, if we reduce their anxiety, then they're able to eat. Things that we know of that help when people are anxious are making things organized and predictable. So we use a lot of structure in our program to make things very predictable and organized and structured so that kids feel safer and they're able to follow through and eat. We also use a lot of support. So that's bringing parents in, and parents have a relationship with their kids. Kids find their parents supportive sometimes. Using these things, we create a system that is going to make it easier for them to eat, and then often they do. Sometimes people think of meal support as just what you do when there's a plate of food in front of you. And I think that's the worst place to put your effort, because everyone's anxiety is high, and You're not going to think of creative solutions. And there's probably not much that you're going to be able to do. The kid that was in yesterday, there was nothing that I could do. She sat down. The situation was not organized. And she couldn't eat, and I couldn't help her. So what would have been helpful is if we did some things before that. We organized things, we had a talk with her, we got everything ready, and we would have had probably more success. So I think of meal support as things that you can do before meals, things that you can do during meals, and things that you can do after meals. Right in the words meal support, is this idea of support. We don't force people to eat. We support them to make it easier for them to eat. So I think of that kids choose to eat. And once in a while, we get a situation where a kid will refuse to eat and won't eat anything. And we have to go to kind of NG protocols and that sort of thing. But almost all the time, kids eat because they figure that this is probably the best way to go at that moment. So when we get kids in the hospital, they eat. They can just as easily refuse and be sent off to a medical unit. The way that we talk about these things, I often get parents with older kids, and they say, well, I can't get them to do anything. If I try and restrict them, they just walk out the door. And these aren't helpful. These are not necessarily things that you need power control to do. So if I was sending someone off to university and they were going to have to feed themselves, I would say, you know what's probably helpful is if you organize yourself and you make a meal plan and you make a structure and you organize what you're going to have. It doesn't require someone doing these things to them. If you can do that, that's great. So the parts of meal support are things that we do beforehand, planning and preparation, things that we do during meals, and things that we do after meals. As we're going over each of these things, if you can think about what part you can play in your role to support these things. I've been working with schools lately and talking about how they can support meal support. So there's things about modifying school schedules, about having someone in, about adding some routine to the school days. If you're a clinician and you're having appointments, if you have your appointment over lunchtime, that's probably going to be a difficult thing for them to handle. So to be aware of those things in that schedule and that organization, that's going to be helpful to these people. Judy's going to jump up here with me on the meal planning part. The point of our meal planning talk is really that when we organize things, when we have structure, it's going to reduce anxiety and we're going to do better.
So those dietitians in the room may be familiar with Ellen Satter. She's what she talks about is the division of responsibility between what parents are responsible when it comes to feeding and what the child is responsible when it comes to feeding. So in the olden days, I used to use the first stands when I was treating people with eating disorders. The parent was to decide what, where, and when, and it was the child's responsibility to eat. Now that's shifted. So when you're feeding a child with an eating disorder, the parents decide what, where, and how much, and the child's responsibility is to eat what's in front of them. So when it comes to, and I touched a little bit about this earlier on in terms of the benefits of having a meal plan. I think beyond just having a meal plan, I think the thing that we're trying to stress here is planning. So whether that's through a meal plan or some sort of structured eating is really, really important to make sure that the child is getting enough to facilitate the weight gain. And I think if you have a set plan and the child is not gaining any weight, you can look back at the plan and see, oh, did I miss something or am I just not providing enough? So it provides that structure. And again, as I spoke to early in the morning, it does lower the anxiety in the youth in terms of knowing what's coming. And it also, I think it lowers anxiety for the parents because they've prepared it and they've planned it and they don't have to do that thinking in the spot. I think when I teach parents the meal plan, and I'm a real strong proponent of planning. I love to plan. But I know, probably too much, but anyway, I can see the anxiety in parents' eyes when I tell them they have to know what they're going to make for dinner 3 days down the road. Because in the real world, that's not the way it works. Come home from work, open up the fridge, decide what to eat. So this, I really stress the importance of planning, but I also recognize that it's going to take a little bit of a while in terms of getting them a system in place that works for their household.
I think it's really difficult for parents sometimes to get into that routine. When parents are able to do this, it really reassures kids and it inspires confidence in them. So I send parents on passes and they say, oh, it went great, it was 2:30 and I forgot, but my daughter said, Mom, it's 2:30, you gotta get snack ready. And I thought, well, gee, that's great, but it'd probably be better if you were remembering, because someday she's not gonna tell you even though she does remember, and then she's gonna miss it. So when parents are on top of it, kids don't have to worry about it. In our video, we have a couple of kids that were in our program. This is Jessica talking. I don't think this is in the video. But she just talks about if there's an unplanned meal, that your thoughts just go on and on. It gives you an excuse to give yourself excuses about why you don't have to do this and why you should be doing something else and being somewhere else. So when things are predictable, it really helps kids manage their anxiety. When we manage their anxiety, it's easier for them to eat. Sometimes what I say is there's two goals when you're doing meal planning: that parents are organized and that kids' anxiety is managed. So generally, we want to kind of plan ahead. We want to specify the what, when, where, how much. We give a couple of choices in our program. That tends to help. Giving too many choices tends to be overwhelming. So parents tend to sit down and do these with their kids. That might work, that might not work. If they do sit down with their kids, giving a few choices may be helpful.
We have a sheet that goes through kind of the meals and stuff, and on it also includes where, what, so that it prompts the parent to think about those sort of things. And simple things as who's going to serve the meal, because if the youth thinks they're going to get their snack and the parent thinks they're going to get the snack, it could result in conflict. So we really kind of try to talk out every little stage of the planning. And when it comes to choices, usually what I say to parents, no one likes to be told what to do, so any bit of involvement and choice tends to be helpful. But if those discussions come with, but I want a butter on the bread, or I won't have this, then you end the conversation and you make the choice. And it's being able to recognize when to be able to pull back. Otherwise, I mean, I have been caught talking about carrots for hours when I should have pulled away, but now I know. So it's being able to know when those conversations are just going like out to left field. If it's a true allergy, we support it. So initially, we will support the allergy, and then we will get it tested. Yeah.
We had someone come in once that was allergic to everything. Someone that couldn't eat anything prepared. Mama had to bring in olive oil and balsamic vinegar and mix her own salad dressing because it was that severe. And then we tested, and it turns out she wasn't allergic to anything.
I mean, that's the same with vegetarianism, right? So we discourage it. We may, if we don't have clear evidence whether it predated the eating disorder, we may allow it initially just to get them in the door. And then I hit them with the chicken. Just joking, right? Something like Okay, things to consider when you're doing planning. One is like menu items, and I bring this up because I have heard stories, and I'm sure Tom has heard stories, about a youth asking for a specific type of bread that's not at the store the parent normally shops at, and they're driving miles to get this sort of bread. And so just to be really mindful about why are you choosing these items when you're doing the planning. The other one is challenge foods, and I spoke about that this morning in terms of the pyramid, is that there are foods that maybe a parent's child used to love, and they think, oh my God, I'm going to give that food again to them. Oh, Mike. I'm going to give that food on our first time together. I'm going to bring that food. I knew they loved it. And I think one of the tools that I use with challenge foods is that I make the youth write out a list of least scary foods to most scary foods. And I make them give that to their parent so they have some sense of what's really going on inside their head. And I find that's a useful tool, and I think the youth and the parents find that helpful as well. And just the last point, which you can talk to.
I was just going to say on those challenge foods, building that into the plan makes them much easier to do. So kids will say, if I know ahead of time, I can mentally prepare for it. So being organized in all those kind of approaches is going to be helpful. And the last point is just that there needs to be a balance between where this patient is at and what the family's needs are. So I had one family in that all the daughter would have was boiled chicken. That was her protein. And the family got kind of tired of that after a while. So the goal is for these kids to eat the same as what the rest of the family's eating, but that's not always where they're at. So we start where we're at and move towards integrating them. I think that being organized around the food, whether it's a written plan or just parents being organized, is really the foundation for meal support. That if you're not organized, it's not probably going to work. Once we've made a plan, you need to go shopping, and you need to cook, and you need to serve. And the point that I like to make in this section is that whenever you have choice and whenever you have responsibility, it creates stress. And the more important the choice, the more stress that it creates. I have another little quote. I'll just let you read this one. This is from Francis, who was also in the video. So she makes a point that I like, that when we take choice away from people, it can actually reduce their stress. So as parents, we always say, well, we want to give kids choice, we want them involved, we want to give them options, we want them to be responsible. And that, in this case, can actually backfire, and that it makes it much more difficult for kids to manage eating. So when they see what's going into the food, it can really stress them out. We have one group a week that's cooking group, and kids go shopping, and they come back and they cook, and then they serve it, and then they eat it. And this is probably the most stressful group of the week, and very challenging. Well, there was one last week that was 3 hours long. Successful 3 hours long. So anytime you have choice, it causes stress. And most of the time, the choices that we make are pretty easy and you can manage them. But for these kids, choosing between chicken and fish can be a tremendously difficult, scary choice. When we put them in the position of having to make those choices, we can create a lot of stress on them. So it can be helpful to take those choices away from them and not have them involved in those. So some of the places the kids may want to have some choice is going shopping and cooking and serving. And so these are areas that you may advise the kids not be involved in, and the parents put some limits on that they can't go shopping and they can't be in the kitchen. And they can't serve their own things because that's going to stress them out, and it's also going to stress parents out. When we limit choice, we can make it easier for these kids to eat. And I think also something that I tell parents is when they're feeling anxious, this is a really good sign that something's not sitting right. So if you're in the kitchen and you're feeling anxious because your daughter's in there, then that's a good sign that she shouldn't be in there, and that this is something that you would probably enjoy more if you're doing it on your own. We recommend not measuring food, and this is a trap that parents often get into and is often done in other programs even. That when kids want to be reassured that they're getting the right amount, but it becomes a trap that they can't kind of escape from. So the story that I always tell is of a family that wound up counting corn pops. And they took one of the boxes from our program, and they emptied it out, and they said, okay, there's 63 corn pops. So a serving is 63 corn pops. So they would serve it, and then their child would say, that's not 63 corn pops. I want you to count it, and I have to see you count it, or I'm not going to eat it. So you get into these kind of endless cycles. Another mom said she measured for her daughter, measured out some rice. Here it's 1 cup. And her daughter said, where did you get those measuring cups from? That's not 1 cup. So we recommend the parents just serve. They learn what the portions look like and not measure, but eyeball it and learn to be confident with portions.
So, I think one of the things, sorry, is that when there is an eating disorder in the room, the parent somehow always second guesses themselves that they don't know what they're doing when it comes to feeding, when in fact they know what they're doing. And so I see our roles as also to really reinforcing that they know what they're doing. When it comes to when it comes to portion size, when I explain portion sizes, I say, this is not an exact science. Don't second guess yourself. I have my food models, I have my written things, I have all my ways of showing portion sizes, but I think if we get so fixated on the exactness of it, that it sets you up for failure. Yeah. And one of the common things I say to parents is that no matter how accurate you are, your child is going to think you're giving them too much. So even if you're measuring behind the scene, and even if it's not the right amount, it's too small, they're still going to say, you're feeding me too much. And I kind of make that analogy in terms of the youth, when they look at themselves in the mirror, as seeing themselves being a lot bigger than they are. It's the same with the plate. And it especially comes with parents. We don't get it quite as much. We may get it with our rice portion, being big sometimes and smaller, but parents, they get pushed all the time around portion sizes.
I think if kids are happy with your portions, then your portions are probably not big enough. So the next section is supported eating. So we've done our planning, we've done our prep, and now we're sitting down and we're eating together. And the goal is just to get through this. The time for planning and discussion is when we were planning and discussing. And now it's a time to follow through with it, whatever plan you've come up with. We find once we get kids at the table, if we've done things properly, we've got a pretty darn good chance of getting them to eat. So they know what's coming, they've agreed, they understand what's happening, and they're more likely to eat. So the way to have success in the kitchen is to have that structure and organization beforehand. And then have a calm, distracting environment that will support the plan that you've already made. We don't want to negotiate or discuss anything that we've negotiated and discussed before, because now we will be anxious and we will give in much more easily. Karen and I in our group ask kids what's helpful during meals for other people to do. And we ask them what's helpful from staff and what's helpful from family. And some of the things they talk about the most is that having some distractions going on is helpful. And we hear that over and over and over again. When you sit down, if there's a conversation going, you can think about food or you can think about something else. So we want them to think about something else. We do trivia at the table. We have conversations. We talk about TV and movies. We do crossword puzzles. We look at horoscopes. At home, people watch TV. Whatever you can do to kind of keep their minds occupied that's not on food. We recommend that people sit down and eat together. There's something about sitting down and eating together that's helpful. So we recommend that parents do that as a tool that may make it easier for these kids. We don't think it's not a rule that parents need to sit down, but it might be helpful. Recovery can take a long time, and we think until kids are able to manage the food themselves, that they need supervision, and that may be many months. So any meal that any meal and snack, if we want to make sure that they're eating it, it needs to be supervised. We think having a consistent schedule, that you sit down together and eat, that you have something prepared to do to distract them, and you have some idea about what's going to be okay to do. So can we watch TV during the meal to distract, or can we not? Do we need a time limit? How many times can you cut a grape? Those kind of things. If you have some idea, and as you go along, you develop a bit of a language and a bit of a standard about what's okay to do at your table and what's not okay to do. 4 pieces for a grape. And we expect 100% completion. What I think the easiest way to think about that is if your plate and their plate looks the same, then that's complete. If your plate is clean and they have sauce spread over and butter underneath and crumbs here, that's not really complete. So they're perfectly able to do that. They just may be motivated to not do that. When someone's doing something that they don't want to do, you don't want to remind them of what they're doing. So if you're crossing a bridge and you're scared of heights, you don't want people pointing over the edge and telling you how far down it is. So if you're scared of eating and you're sitting down at the table and everyone's saying, "Oh, look at that, that looks really good. Wow, are those the portions that they're giving? What flavor is that? Are you enjoying that?" Every time that comes up, that's reminding them of the difficult thing that they're doing. So we try to, as much as we can, avoid talking about food, especially their food, about weight, about appearance, but really about anything that's stressful. And that's going to be different for different people. But whatever, those are areas that we can definitely make people upset about. When we are doing meal support, we're there to be helpful. And so I recommend that people do things that are helpful. Following the same kind of rules can be helpful. So if they have to clear their plate and you have half and you say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so full, I couldn't eat another bite," that's probably not going to be helpful. So maybe we can figure out a different way to do that. So maybe we serve ourselves less. We recommend that people avoid things that are sugar-free or fat-free or diet foods because, again, it can cause problems and bad feelings. So if you're having fat-free and they're having full fat, then there's some reason that you're avoiding fat because fat must be bad and you're not having any fat and I'm having fat. So we want to do whatever we can notice that makes them feel like they're a normal person sitting down to a normal meal. And this is what everyone does, and maybe she has to do things a little bit differently, but that she doesn't stick out. This doesn't mean that we recommend that parents eat the same thing as kids. Parents have different needs, and so we recommend if you're sitting down together to eat, that you eat something that's right for you and not to try and match and balance. That's something a trap that parents often get stuck into. Sometimes we see different kinds of eating disorder behavior during meals. That's hiding, smearing, crumbling, dropping, eating for a long time, cutting things into tiny bits, doing odd things with their food, opening up sandwiches and eating the lettuce out first. So we recommend calling those things out in a gentle, encouraging kind of way. One other strategy that we find helpful is thinking about mechanical eating. That for these kids, they just have to eat in a very kind of mechanical way that's not about whether you like it or whether you enjoy it or whether you feel hungry. It's just that you just have to.
It's not based on hunger cues.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Judy added that to my slide. And we want to pick our battles a bit. That if people are cutting things into tiny bites, we can call them on that and say, you kind of need to use bigger bites. but they'll probably keep doing it, and that might not be the thing that we want to focus on right now. That what we might need to focus on right now is completion, and then we can start to work on those other issues as we go along. We have a bit of a balance that you have to figure out, that we want to talk as little about food as possible, but we also want to point out things that are going wrong. So if things are getting dropped on the floor, we kind of need to call those out. But the more we call those out, the more we're going to raise anxiety. So to find the right balance in those situations, we want to be kind of as gentle as we can. And the point of this slide is to try and use the least intrusive kind of way of addressing those things. So if we say, oh, I noticed something fall on the floor there, it's less, it requires less power or challenge. If we say, I saw what you did and you need to eat that, you might have a different result. As your relationship grows, you may be able to use a more of a directing approach. We find with newer staff, just kind of pointing things out is often enough. At the end of the meal, parents want to know, what do we do if they don't finish? I think of it as a safety issue. If someone is not eating enough, if their energy in is not matching their energy out, then we have a safety issue on our hands. If someone's weight is not a healthy weight or their weight is dropping, then there's not a safe amount of activity that they can still do if they're not taking in enough food. So their physical safety is what needs to be taken care of. That means that they may not be able to leave the house, they may not be able to go to school, they may not be able to go to soccer practice. These are not consequences in the way that we think of consequences. This is a safety situation. So it's not something that we're not going to let you go to school because you did a bad thing. It's not really safe for you to go now because you're not eating enough. And so now you need to take it easy because it's not really safe for you to be going out at this time. The last part is our post-meal part. So we often focus on getting these kids to eat because that's what we've been talking about. But that once they finish eating, it's not really the end for them. They're left with all kinds of feelings of guilt and fear and anxiety and physical pain. So it can be worse for kids after they finish than when they're eating or before. And it's really important to be aware of that so that we can support them and we can prevent other behaviors from emerging. So the ones that we worry about most in eating disorders are purging, exercise, and self-harm. So these are actually really effective ways of reducing anxiety if that's what you're anxious about. So if people eat and then they purge, they don't feel bad afterwards. So what we want to do is prevent those things from happening with supervision and support so that they don't have the opportunity to purge or exercise after meals. And hopefully that will prevent those behaviors from happening. It's also the same way that we treat those things when we see them. If someone is purging, then the way that we stop people from purging is to stop them from purging. And once we stop them from purging, it's easier for them to not purge. If that makes sense. So what we do on the unit is that we lock bathrooms so that people can't go purge. And at home, parents would supervise so that when kids feel that way, they can't go to the bathroom, they can't purge. And that will make it easier next time for them to not do that. We just like to point out that, of course, there's jumping jacks and going for jogging, but there's all kinds of different ways that kids use to be active and to burn calories. Ones that we see a lot are standing or perching. People ask about perching. that's sitting right on the edge of the chair, or is the... or being helpful in doing chores. And what we see is that this is often a really conscious effort for kids to burn calories. And so if we let them do those things, we're creating a pattern of behavior that when they feel anxious, they need to burn calories. So what do we want to do in that post-meal time is really supervision and distraction. That we keep these kids busy and occupied. We prevent those behaviors, and we give them time to be able to manage their own behavior. So when you're really anxious, an hour later, you're not generally going to be as anxious. When you're happy, an hour later, you're not going to be as happy. So emotions go down over time. If we give these kids time, they often are able to manage their own behavior. We want to look back and say what worked. So if we had success, let's look back and try and do that again. If something didn't work, well, why didn't that work, and see what we can do. Meal support and recovery is not about one day and having success one day. It's about having success over a long time. And these things often take a long time to put into practice and to make work. I think my last one is this one. I always like to remind parents that being bad at something is just a step to being good at something. When we send parents off on passes, they often worry about, they say, well, it was a disaster. They get very down on themselves. But that's how we learn. So when we're doing meal support, if we sit down and like I did yesterday, I had someone come in, they didn't eat. Okay, now I know what I need to do next time that's going to make that better. So I don't feel bad that didn't go well yesterday. Now I have some things that next time this comes up, we'll have a better solution. I think that's the end of my thing.